This video is about the experiences of the neurodivergent leaders I interviewed as part of this research. The first two questions were, what do you do and what has your career path looked like so far? Everyone I interviewed had more than one job. They worked as access consultants, audio describers, lecturers, directors, producers, artists, and researchers. Everyone had some experience of directly managing people. That was in their current jobs or in jobs that they used to have. Everyone had worked a lot of different jobs in the past. People had worked in universities, local councils, and had done lots of jobs in the creative industry. I asked whether people preferred working as a freelancer or in salaried positions. People preferred a mixture of salaried and freelance jobs at the same time. People found that access needs were met much more often when they worked as freelancers than when they worked as salaried staff. When I asked more about this, one person shared that it was harder to meet access needs consistently over time, but most organizations can meet access needs in the short term. They also suggested that because their freelance work was relatively expensive, the organization was more invested in the work going well. Working as a freelancer also meant avoiding tasks that were unpleasant, like networking, unstructured meetings, and small talk. While these were all things the interviewees could do, they took more energy and time to plan and recover from than for their non-disabled colleagues. It was also helpful to be in charge of the room where they worked. They could work in quiet spaces rather than open-plan offices with lots of noise. However, just working as a freelancer was difficult. People were working in short-term contracts that lasted 3 to 6 months, which meant that money was a big worry for people. It offered less structure as well, and often meant working lots of extra hours than expected. People's experiences of salaried jobs were quite draining and difficult. One person shared that their work is incredibly important to them, so when it isn't going well, their mental health suffers. But salary jobs were important for stability and structure. Working in a mixture of jobs meant that people could recharge and recover by doing creative work in ways that met their access needs and let people keep their perspective. They weren't bad at their jobs or failing. It was something specific about that job and organization that was leading to problems. The next question I asked was, what parts of your job do you enjoy? People shared enjoying the creative aspects of their jobs, like directing a play and running workshops. Some people enjoyed detail-orientated work, like transcribing, writing reports, or funding applications and project plans. Everyone's answers had one thing in common. They really enjoyed being able to make things better for other disabled people. One person shared an example of running meetings in a neurodivergent friendly way. They explicitly welcomed info dumping and long tangents, and they didn't let people talk over each other in meetings. This person's colleagues were extremely grateful, and they had much more productive meetings. Another person shared that they enjoyed being able to make things better for freelancers at their organization. They made sure they were paid on time, had clearer contracts, and knew what they were entitled to during projects. This extended to managing people directly. The people I interviewed liked getting to know the people they manage and putting support in place so people could feel valued, heard, and capable. Then I asked the opposite question. What parts of your job do you find most difficult? Most people's jobs involved trying to change their organization to be better places for disabled people to work. The most difficult things were related to that. One thing was having to constantly remind people of access needs. One person described this as being a support worker for the organization's memory. Sometimes people would need reminding of an access need that had been mentioned only minutes before, like multiple people not talking at once in meetings. Sometimes things that had been agreed on stopped happening when things got busy or stressful at the organization. Sometimes meeting access needs made other people feel uncomfortable, so they didn't happen. In the above example, Someone shared that they had an access need related to auditory processing and noise sensitivity. They needed people to speak one at a time during meetings. But for some neurotypical people, it's a positive social sign to be interrupting and interjecting during conversations. It shows excitement and that you're listening. Similarly, when some neurotypical people organize events, they associate lots of activity and noise as a sign that the event is going well and that people are enjoying themselves. When it was pointed out that by speaking over one another, they were ignoring an access need, people reacted defensively. It's one thing to meet an access need by spending a little more money or time, but some access needs require neurotypical people to be less comfortable, at least temporarily. That wasn't something everyone was willing to do all of the time. For some people, there were specific relationships that made their jobs difficult. These were usually relationships with other senior leaders in an organization. Sometimes they were the direct managers of people I interviewed. Having a good manager had a very big impact on how people felt at work, and the best managers were usually disabled people themselves. One person suggested that any organization hiring a neurodivergent or disabled senior leader should invest in facilitated group coaching for the senior leadership team. This was seen as particularly important if the senior leadership team was growing for the first time. Without this, feelings of insecurity and vulnerability came up for existing senior leaders who were sharing responsibilities with people for the first time, who may have very different ways of working. Two answers were about being in senior leadership positions specifically. The first was being asked to engage in secret keeping. People in senior leadership positions know about changes that are going to happen before other people, like new jobs positions, people being fired, there being more or less funding in an organization, etc. A lot of this information is considered sensitive and isn't immediately shared with everyone else in the team. In particular, people struggled to keep secrets about mistakes that an organization had made. Most people I interviewed shared feeling very uncomfortable about keeping secrets. They valued openness and fairness, and they often wanted to tell people they were managing about potential changes that might affect them, so that they could be informed and make decisions that helped them. People felt more comfortable keeping secrets if they knew why they were being asked to do it, and knew when the information would be shared with everyone. The other difficult part of being a senior leader was making compromises that negatively affected other disabled people. Being a leader means you have to make decisions based on lots of things at once. Money, staff time, what your artists need, what your audience expects, and what other senior leaders are willing to agree to. Sometimes this means making decisions that help disabled people less than you would like to. For example, one person I interviewed shared an experience of asking for changes to how relaxed performances were done at a venue. They wanted it to be as accessible as possible, with different lighting and sound options to the main performances, along with staff training, choir areas, and sonic stories for the performances. Other senior leaders were only willing to implement some of these changes, and the disabled leader couldn't convince them to do more. The last thing people talked about was organizations having bad HR systems, which stands for Human Resources Systems. This made all of the other problems worse. For example, some organizations didn't have standard practices for induction and probation periods, so disabled leaders didn't have clear job security or feedback about their roles. In particular, most organizations didn't have effective conflict resolution processes. If access needs were being repeatedly ignored by another staff member, there was no way of telling somebody else about the problem and resolving it. If senior leaders were arguing often and couldn't work together anymore, there was no kind of mediation available. What this meant was that neurodivergent leaders never had their issues listened to, resolved, and apologized for. Non-disabled leaders became more resentful and distant, and disabled leaders felt more burnt out and isolated in their organizations. The last two questions were specifically about access needs. The first question was, when have your access needs been met well, and what did that look like? People's examples focused on two things: lack of fuss and still being seen as good at their job. There were lots of examples of people meeting access needs quickly without needing reminded. In the best examples, non-disabled people would read someone's access rider and thought about how to make changes without needing to be told. For example, one person's access rider listed having light sensitivity and that they might need a quiet, dark space to recover at the end of the day. A lighting technician read this and reduced the level of stage lighting on that day. There wasn't any fuss. In another example, someone was on the edge of a meltdown after a very stressful meeting. A colleague approached them, needing to discuss something urgently. The neurodivergent leader explained what was happening for them, and the colleague changed how they were communicating. They didn't chat at the start or end of the discussion, they left more gaps and pauses, and they took more time themselves to communicate clearly. They were still able to resolve the urgent issue. I think this is a really important example. When a disabled person's access needs are more visible, people can think that they are less good at their job. The colleague could have reacted by saying, "Oh, you're having a hard time, I'll do this myself." Instead, the colleague still included the neurodivergent leader's inputs and just adapted the way they were communicating. The last question I asked everyone was, what are the common problems you face with implementing your access need? Most people had already talked about the problems with implementing access needs in earlier questions. People mostly talked about problems with people and culture at their organization. There were rarely problems with funding access equipment, for example. One person shared how often they were expected to solve their own access issues. Their organization hadn't submitted to Access to Work before, so they were responsible for filling in forms, purchasing equipment, and ongoing reporting, something that should have been their line manager's responsibility. They shared that they were trying to work on how to communicate the extra labor of managing their own access adjustments in future jobs. I asked one person a bonus question: how they found the experience of managing neurotypical people and a neurodivergent person. This person really enjoyed being able to offer a supportive and accessible environment for everyone they managed. They learned that their neurotypical colleagues would rather be asked questions to reflect on their actions. I asked one person a bonus question: how they found the experience of managing neurotypical people as a neurodivergent person. This person really enjoyed being able to offer a supportive and accessible environment for everyone they managed. They learned that their neurotypical colleagues would rather be asked questions to reflect on their actions rather than being told that they had done or said something ableist. They went on to some coaching sessions to get better at asking questions that helped the people they managed. They also learned to set clearer boundaries about the types of support they could and couldn't give. In the past, they agreed to working in person a lot to support people in their team. This was very hard for them because the workspace was noisy and bright. Now they're better at saying no to things that will affect them too much.